name is Chong. I'm a first-year PhD student in the College of Education, and the title of our, and I say our because my co-author is out in Nashville giving a separate presentation right now. Our talk is Educational Artifacts of Prescriptive Political Curricula in India and the People's Republic of China. Basically, I know you might be wondering why an educational history paper might be in a panel titled Healthy Societies, but I think the case I would like to make today is why the government's vision of a healthy society and the people who that government educates, their version of a healthy society might be different, and that is a really important distinction. So, two educational artifacts I'm going to talk about today is from India. We bring the Draft National Education Policy called the NEP, which is how I'll refer to it, from last year. It is the fourth iteration of this policy and the first major change to this policy done under the right-wing BJP government of Narendra Modi. And from China, we bring the quotations from Chairman Mao Zedong, also known as Mao Zedong, or the Little Red Book. Looks like this. And it's from 1964. So the argument that we would like to share with you today is fourfold, which is that both countries use a politically prescriptive curriculum, which means that it has explicitly political outcomes in it for its students' education. Two, they do that via a kind of cultural hegemony, which means a dominant culture, and nationalistic sentiment. Three, those students simultaneously represent regime legitimacy, which means they're kind of associated with the elite, and they're proof that those governments and those regimes are providing for those people. And lastly, that these curricula pretend to promote egalitarianism. But I want to start with kind of like a brief political history of these artifacts, but acknowledging the current political moment in both countries. So in November of last year, we had the Ayodhya Holy Site verdict by the Supreme Court of India that effectively gave this site, which had been the site of a mosque for a significant period of time prior, to Hindus, which allowed for, which really illustrates kind of the way in which a constitutionally secular India is kind of shifting into kind of what's known as a Hindu or a Hindu nationalist state. The Citizenship Amendment Act, the CAA, which also restricts the ability to provide political asylum for Muslim refugees from Muslim countries if they are Muslim, again subverting that constitutional secularity. And also the revocation of Article 370, which granted political autonomy to Jammu and Kashmir. And then in China, we also have the mass incarceration and concentration camps of Uyghur Muslims. And of course, that is showcasing the authoritarian nature of the Chinese state at this time. In addition to their responses to the Hong Kong protests, we see the current coronavirus outbreak and their response there too as a strictly authoritarian, and an example of the authoritarian state and the way in which that state is cracking or straining. So that's kind of just acknowledging where we're at and how these two artifacts play into the current political climate. So I would just want to share with you a brief timeline of the national education policy in India. And I'll be going back and forth between our two cases throughout, since we organized this thematically. What's most important here is that this is the fourth iteration of this policy. And the contrast between these two artifacts is where a policy starts in the Red Book that kind of yields China's current policy, and where a policy ends up after multiple iterations like the NEP. The Red Book from China starts within the Cultural Revolution, which we know as a multi-million casualty genocide from 1966 to 1976, really centered around this cult of personality. But the reason why I just want to give a brief entree into the Cultural Revolution is this idea that, from an educational standpoint, that teachers are this like remnant of the bourgeois class. And that's important to understanding how this book existed as a curriculum and as a way of teaching, as a pedagogy, because it really subverted the idea that teachers were the arbiters of knowledge. So both of these artifacts really advocate for this, or kind of showcase this idea of school as political training. You can see from the vision statement of the national education policy in India that there's this sense that there's this uncomfortable tension between providing an excellent schooling and providing equitable access to schooling. This idea that a vibrant knowledge society is something that is accessible to all people, and that is not necessarily something that is true in today's Indian schools. In China, this same idea of trying to create kind of competitive and competitive students with contemporary skills allowed, and also understanding that there's a cultural continuity at play is really foregrounded in these two artifacts. And I think this quote is really important, especially when thinking about the China case, that there's this idea that a text like the Little Red Book can represent a sacred tradition and can have this like mesmerizing effect like that of scripture. Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of how I want, if you were to take anything away from this talk, that prescriptive political curricula can take on this effect of scripture. And so there's this kind of idea, and the way we kind of approached it was kind of using a theory framework from the U.S., which is problematic in some spaces. We acknowledge for sure. One person we talk about a little bit is David Lavery in our paper, that in these competing purposes of schooling, there's a lot. If you take that theoretical framework and put it into a case like India or China, it implies that there isn't vast disparities and inequalities in those schooling spaces, and so we want to make sure that that's acknowledged here. That there is on the ground reality, there is vast inequalities in people's access to schooling and access to quality schooling. And so when we think about this pretense of, and the third of his goals, so he has social efficiency, social mobility, and democratic equality, that if we think about the idea of promoting equality, democratic equality, right, we have in India a really difficult balance between between cultural continuities, again, and so in this case, the use of languages, classical languages like Tamil, Telugu, Malayalam, and Kannada, representing the south of India, which is new for this policy, but also understanding that there is a need to fit a lot into this curriculum. For example, a class here at MSU that meets twice a week for 80 minutes represents 40 hours of what otherwise would have been which is part of your 10,000+ hours of your life, right? So there's a lot to fit into a very limited space, and so that kind of leads us to our broader analysis too of this idea of continuity and change, meaning that there's this really persistent tension between local cultures, local traditions, which are of course in flux in and of themselves, but also this desire to be competitive on the global scale and at the global stage. So again, this idea these governments really see a healthy society is in a healthy society that these students have a sense of what it means to be Indian and what it means to be Chinese. But they also want these students to, as symbolic capital for their countries, to represent the developmental potential. And so this kind of sees that kind of 21st century values, and from, I'm going to skip this quote actually, from the Ministry of Education in China, they really focus on this idea of this rejuvenation of the nation. And I think after traumatic experiences in both China and India with historical colonialism and monarchical rule, there's a sense that these educational systems can't achieve that social change, but at what cost, which is a really concrete identity of being Indian or Chinese, but also being competitive at the global stage. So those are the big points of the argument. I'll just quickly conclude with these 3 discussion points that we kind of came up with, which is that, adapting those global practices and curricula to local contexts. The null curriculum, that which is left out of the curriculum, that can be violent and erasing of minority identities especially, and the role of students in legitimizing a nationalist agenda. I'm going to leave this last slide up during our question period because these are questions that we still have since this is early stage research. But I want to thank you all for being here for this presentation. I also want to thank the Council of Graduate Students and the College of Education for funding our research. We really appreciate it. I'm happy to take